So Mike, I know you haven't heard this story before, and you haven't really met our guest before.
No, sir.
This is going to be something new for you and for most of our listeners, I guess those of you that don't know him from Purists. But we have Art here, or as you may know him on PuristPro as Dr. No, who has come to share with us the story. Having heard it myself, I call it the story for a reason. This is the most awesome watch acquisition story I've ever heard. And Mike has actually never heard it, so you're going to get all of his shock and awe live and direct.
Order up!
Before we start the story, I think we should actually introduce the watch, which I had the opportunity to photograph before the show. It's an Omega. It's a Seamaster.
Right. It's a Norman Morris edition Seamaster, probably produced in 56.
And why is it called a Norman Morris?
Well, Norman Morris was the agent for Omega in the United States.
Got it.
And while they brought in Omegas that were entirely produced in Switzerland, they also brought in raw movements. I'm not sure. They may have actually produced dials here as well.
Interesting.
Now, don't quote me on that one, but that's a distinct possibility.
Gotcha.
There are dials unique to Norman Morris's that were obviously either made under contract in Switzerland or here.
Are they rarer than the traditional same era Omega?
It's not that difficult to find an American issue, I would guess, not having any data, that America was probably the largest single market for Omega in the 1950s and 60s when Norman Morris had their monopoly on distribution of Omega.
On the back of that watch, there is some engraving. Does that have to do with the story?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, without the engraving, there would have been no story.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Let's dive right into it.
The time frame is late summer of 1985.
Okay.
I am having lunch at the original Pantry Cafe, downtown LA.
Okay.
Sitting at the counter, I brought along with me a copy of Robert Caro's biography, the first volume of his biography. He has written 3 or 4 volumes. At the time, the book had just come out. I think he finished it in the last 3 or 4 years. So he had one volume come out then in 1985, and then there were other volumes that came out later. But basically, I was reading the first volume when it had just come out. And Caro's book on Johnson is considered to be the definitive biography of Lyndon Johnson by at least a few academics. So here I am, sitting at the counter, reading the book, and in walks a gentleman who I would have guessed to have been in his 70s. My first instinct was to think that he was maybe in the military because he walked erectly and he had this air of confidence about him. He walks in, glances at me, pulls up the seat right next to mine. He orders lunch. Then he proceeded to strike up a conversation with me.
Did that have to do with the book that you were carrying?
Well, yes. After several minutes, he said something to the effect, I can tell just by looking at the book that you're reading that you're an interesting person, or words to that effect. He goes, by chance, have you ever heard of the Freemasons? And I gave him a fairly detailed answer, which impressed him, because the next thing he said was, well, I would like to invite you to one of our lodge meetings. I said, sure, why not? This is 1985, so he wrote down my name and address. Sure enough, about a week later, I get a letter in the mail, and I recall this distinctly. It was on what I thought was a business firm's letterhead. It was a fairly short letter saying it was a pleasure meeting you, and I would like to invite you to our next open function at a lodge in Pasadena. That was early fall, late summer of 85. As it happened, I was about to take a lengthy overseas trip. Even though I really intended to follow up, I decided after thinking 2 and 3 times about it, it'd be best not to, because there'd be nothing that I could do being overseas. I wouldn't be able to follow up an invitation to go through the initiation ceremonies. So I filed the letter away and forgot about it.
That seems unfortunate.
For how long?
Well,
Not to jump the gun, but you're killing me with the suspense.
let's fast forward about 15 years. At that same time, which is roughly year 2000, I was brought back into a conversation about joining the fraternity. Obviously, these are totally separate aspects of my life, but they converged again at that same time. I became a member of the fraternity in 2001, and that is exactly when I started collecting watches.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's a coincidence, right?
Sure.
So I transitioned from a Glashütte Original active collector to being a vintage Omega collector.
Mm-hmm.
I added a piece here, piece there, piece here, piece there. 2011, I was in the city of Whittier.
Okay.
Which is not really the mecca for watches.
No, it is not. But you never know.
Sure.
Because you can find gold in the strangest places.
Yes, you can.
So I'm in Whittier. I happen to be taking my girlfriend at the time to a doctor's appointment. And we're driving down Whittier Boulevard. And on the north side of Whittier Boulevard, I see this pawn shop. And I'm one of those people who gets flashes of instincts. There was something about that pawn shop that said I had to go inside. So I dropped my girlfriend off, doubled back to the pawn shop, walked in. The owner comes up and says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm interested in vintage Omegas." And without saying a word, he points down at the glass case. And I look down, and there are two vintage Omegas in the glass case.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them are gold, yellow gold. Both of them are on gold bracelets. Just as an aside here, the gold bracelets were not Omega bracelets. They were custom-made 14-karat bracelets.
Okay. 14-karat bracelets on
18-karat
watches.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't sound quite right.
Well, they were custom bracelets, and he got the bracelets somewhere, and they happened to fit.
So why not?
Omegas. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. 18 millimeter. I asked to look at a constellation, which I can tell right off the bat is an interesting piece. I think it was a reference 2652. But after looking at it closely for 3 seconds, I realized the dial had been redone, crown had been replaced. So I said, "Nah, I'm not interested in this." And he goes, "Well, can I ask why?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's a redone dial. The crown's been replaced, blah, 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 blah." And he goes, "Really?" The guy really didn't know a whole lot about Omegas. And that's my experience generally with pawn shops. They know about Rolex.
And Rolex.
And Rolex?
And they have some familiarity maybe with Patek, but that's about it. I mean, anything outside of the commodity watches, they really don't know a whole lot about. So I said, okay, well, let me see the other one. I'm looking at it up close. I can tell it's all there. And I said, "How much?" I don't remember, but he wanted to sell it with the bracelet. I said, "I'm not interested in the bracelet."
Mm-hmm.
I explained why. I would only want to buy the head only. I made an offer, and he said, "Well, let me ask somebody that I know, a watchmaker, whether that's a fair offer." A day or two later, I got a call back from him saying, "I accept your offer." But while I'm looking the watch over, obviously I look at it from all aspects, and on the back of the case is an engraving. I happen to understand exactly what the engraving meant because right about the same time I got into watches, I also joined a lodge. Mm-hmm. So I was familiar with the terminology. And that watch had been gifted to the Grand Master. Now, it doesn't say which state. It had been gifted to the Grand Master of a lodge in 1958 for being Grand Master for the Masonic year of 1957-58.
Okay.
I think I can recite this from memory. Presented to Most Worshipful Leo E. Anderson by your Grand Lodge officers, October 3rd, 1958. So, when I got the watch, I mean, I knew that it had the engraving on it, obviously.
Right.
And I might have even said, well, that engraving takes a little bit off of its value when I was negotiating with a pawn shop owner. But in my mind, that enhanced its desirability. A year goes by, exactly a year. It's February 2012. It's a Saturday afternoon, and I'm at home. I just don't have a whole lot to do. And the watch happens to be with me. Usually I keep most of my watches in the safe deposit box, but it was its turn in the rotation. So I'm looking at the back and I'm thinking, there's all kinds of information on the internet. Mm-hmm. Let me look up this Grand Master of a state lodge. So I've got not only the first and last name, but also the middle initial. So I pop it into Google search, and immediately out comes his obituary in the LA Times. I'm reading the obituary. He was born in the early years of the 20th century in the Midwest, was an attorney, and there were a few other tidbits in there. He passed away in 1993. So, a well-known and connected attorney in LA from the 30s till the time of his death. There was a line in the obituary about his law firm. I go look them up. The name of the law firm, I believe, is something like Mumford, Meserve, and Humphreys.
Okay.
I look up their website, and they are located in downtown LA, just a block from the original Pantry.
Interesting.
And at that moment, I remembered that the gentleman that I talked to and I had shared lunch with 25 years before, his first name was Leo.
Wow.
So now it's like, my gosh, don't tell me that I've got Leo's watch. I am now feverishly searching for an image of him. And sure enough, after almost an hour, there was a picture of Leo Anderson in the USC archives. The first instant I realized it was the same guy. I am literally going bananas. It's like, how could this be? 25 years ago, I had lunch with this guy, and now I am wearing his watch.
From a random lunch at the Pantry to another random pawn shop in Whittier,
Right.
that you found, and that it's a gift from the lodge.
Right.
To
Yeah,
the,
it's
to the
very
Grandmaster.
full circle. It's very,
Really?
very full circle.
It's wonderful.
I mean, there's you deciding to join the Masonic Lodge and then him being the Grandmaster and his invitation.
And you ended up falling in love just by chance with the type of watch that you had saw 25 years earlier.
Well, I can't honestly say that I remember the watch on his wrist that day.
That's the point. That you ended up loving vintage Omegas essentially separately from the fact that that's what he was wearing.
Right, yeah.
You just so happened that you were looking for vintage Omegas and had nothing to do with the fact that he had an Omega on at the
he
time.
just so happened to have it. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
Art, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to hear the story about the watch. Continue, please, to fight the good fight.
Thanks, Chase. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, our pleasure. Cheers.
Cheers. This episode of On Time was recorded and engineered by Michael Senderovich with supervision by Tim Hatayama.
Team OTP is Kenshu Production and Savada and Dune on social media.
Our theme song was composed and recorded by Hubie Wang.
For the entire OTP team, this is Mike.
And this is Chase. Thank you for listening to On Time.